Welcome. I'm glad to meet you here in our broadcast and our podcast, using A Course in Miracles, using our contact with the Holy Spirit in order to reflect ideas. And today we want to reflect really our concepts now, or how we were looking the last time to mind and spirit. And of course, within the mind and the thinking faculty, it is, you could say, what conceptual mind is really a container of concepts that are carried around for eons of time. And so we want to reflect at what is this foundation of concepts within the human conceptual mind. And this foundation of concepts is really what Jesus calls in A Course in Miracles, which we teach here, the ego, right? And of course there are an uncountable almost amount of references to the ego, so it is a little bit hard to teach it. But since we arrive here also in the clarifications of terms, to look at the ego versus and the miracle, so we have here a premise given by Jesus Christ as we said, as a use of terms, using here this Sparkle version, where this use of terms was put in the beginning of the course as an introduction, so to speak, to clarify what kind of terms are used in this Course in Miracles, and what would be good to know about it when you read about it, or when you start studying it, or even after many years of studying and teaching this Course in Miracles. I think it's very interesting and a very good perspective to get into this vernacular, or how Jesus describes it, give it maybe perspectives within the mind, give it understanding, or give it even a definition. And so I have chosen also from the textbook two different sources where Jesus uses the ego and gives an understanding to know about the ego, because one thing we can always know once we have undergone an experience is that we are talking about something that has absolutely no reality whatsoever. There is no reality to what we call the ego. There is no reality to the ego's thought system, and therefore there is no reality within that conceptual mind following its perspective of what in truth is just the game within the ego thought system. And there is no ego without an identified thinker or a being believing that it could have an ego. So it is always still the I, the human sense of I am here, or I am doing something, I know something, or I don't know how to deal with things, or I know perfectly well what it is. And that aspect of the I ego comes from the Latin word ego, which has been taken, but it was already by the Greek philosophers discovered, and taken a look at it as probably not much different than what we do now with A Course in Miracles, and at the end simply renouncing that we call the ego by giving all its aspects and beliefs or sense of reality to the higher mind, to the spirit mind, to the mind of the Holy Spirit, and asking for the truth and letting ourselves be directed and shown what the truth actually is of any concept that we hold about ourselves, about the other, about the world. And of course, we direct our mind always to the practice of the lesson of the day. And this is, I want to make definitely a reference, a cross-reference to that lesson that I'm sharing today with you, and so in the next days too, because it is the lesson there is no love but God's, and it already directs the mind towards not to try to find love in the world or what the world offers. And of course that directive to whole mind, to Christ mind, is only needed because this is what the human consciousness tried to do. I, as a human being, tried to find love in the world or in worldly aspects and worldly representations of love, and tried to define love within my connection or giving meaning, and so experiencing me in that limitation of the world as it is perceived or as it is experienced. And this was, of course, brought up the necessity, the need to be aligned, and that alignment would be to be very clear, not to seek love where it is not. He would express it in the lesson 127, and that continues then in the lessons that we will have in the next days, which will teach us exactly what we are talking about, that the world that we see holds nothing that we want. That is then 128, and then comes 129, that there is a world beyond this world. It says beyond this world there is a world that I want, that we really want. And then it comes to the perspective, it is impossible to see two worlds, lesson 130. And no one can fail who seeks to reach the truth, and arriving then to, you could say that's like the peak, maybe even of the entire mind training lesson period of 1 year. I lose the world from all I thought it was, directing the mind to the experience that there is no such thing as a world. But going back to this starting point today, 127, there is no love but God's. First, he gives us a very nice and clear outlook that no course whose purpose is to teach. See, maybe whatever you have as an idea of a course in your mind, I'm teaching here a course in miracles. But of course there are thousands of other courses in the spiritual marketplace available. But he says here, no course whose purpose is to teach you to remember what you really are. And that is clearly what the Course in Miracles fulfills as its purpose, this remembrance, to remember that I remember what I really am. And no course could fail to emphasize that there can never be a difference in what you really are and what love is. There can never be a difference in what I really am and what love is, because it must direct to the love of God, and so clarify that it can only be the love of God that is the only love. And everything that is singular and doesn't have an opposite, it is impossible that the ego could do something with that. So that is the connection that is very important to, let's say, create a foundation, a fundament, and become aware of how the love of God, how we could even bring that together in perspectives of ego concepts. And this is just when there are seen differences between what we are and what love is. Love's meaning is your own and shared by God himself. That is what love's meaning is. For what you are is what he is. What I am is what God is. And you might say that for a moment to yourself. What I am is what God is. There is no love but his, and what he is is everything there is. There is no love but His, but God's, and what He is, what God is everything there is. There is no limit placed upon Himself, and so are you unlimited as well. Because there is no limit in God, there is no ego in God. So you, me, as the sons of God, as the one Son of God, are unlimited also. And that is what our nature is. That is what our mind in truth is. And then he makes it very clear, because to see a world or to identify with the world is, of course, then to give rise to the ego and to believe and trust into these ego's doctrines. But he says here very clearly that no law that the world obeys, or you could say that the ego teaches and offers you, can help you grasp love's meaning. So you can stop looking for love or for the meaning of love in anything that has to do with the limited conceptual mind, with the ego thought system. What the world believes, he continues, was made to hide love's meaning, not to find love's meaning, to hide love's meaning. That is what we made up a world and used the ego thought system for, and to keep it dark and secret. And there is no one principle the world upholds but violates the truth of what love is and what you are as well. So here is a conclusive thought: seek not within the world to find yourself, to find who you are, to find your true self. Love is not found in darkness and in death. This is what the world really represents, a seeing darkly. As Paul said, you're not looking to a dark mirror, you're looking darkly at the mirror of your own mind. And that darkly seeing is the thinking with the ego mind, with the ego thought system. And further down in the practice part, when he gives us the directive how to change that for ourselves, he makes another emphasis, saying that the world that seems to hold you prisoner can be escaped by anyone who doesn't hold it dear. So this is an action of the mind. This is a decision, brother, that I can simply decide to not hold dear the world I see. And by not holding it dear, I'm no longer prisoner of this world. I'm in that freeing up, in that action, in that experience of escaping the world that previously bound me. Withdraw all value. That is what it means translated to not hold the world dear. Withdraw all value, and have placed upon its meager offerings and senseless gifts, and let the gift of God replace them all. Withdraw all value that you have placed upon the world, that you have placed upon its meager offerings and its senseless gifts. That is really what the world offers. That is where the ego has its domain and lives in and makes everything so real, what is still a complete illusion in one's own mind. Wonderful, isn't it, how that is expressed? And let the gift of God replace all the ego's gifts, all the ego's offerings. Yeah, this is a very gorgeous, very valuable lesson. And so from there, I think we're gonna make this cross-reference into, or we start continuing in what we were already starting out in the last episodes of this new series, looking at how to use the terms as they are used in A Course in Miracles, and seeing also, becoming clear about it, how Jesus terms that in the sense of having started out with mind and spirit, and now coming to the perspective of the ego, what the ego is, and giving then an outlook, what is the miracle. We probably might just be able to cover what is the ego and then continue next time with the miracle. But he uses in these paragraphs talking about the ego several times the question, what is the ego? Because this is a question given you to look at and think about it and determine for yourself if you still have here meanings that you, where there's a value involved in how you think about yourself and the world and how you see yourself and the world. But it will still be an illusion, and that's how he starts out this teaching in these clarifications. He says illusions will not last. See, everything that will not last is not your reality, has nothing to do with reality. Everything that comes and goes is therefore an illusion. And if you know that something that doesn't last is an illusion, then you also know that it will ultimately not make you happy, or it will not give you perfect peace. It would not offer you ultimate joy and happiness. But this is what you are entitled to: ultimate joy and happiness and perfect peace. Okay? So we have to turn away from the illusions, from the ego, and completely depend on the Holy Spirit's guidance and how He translates for us all our illusions into the truth. So here the use of terms, the clarifications of terms, illusions will not last. This is then the second section within these clarifications about the ego, the miracle. Yeah? Illusions will not last. Their death is sure, and this alone is certain in their world. It is the ego's world because of this. First time asking, what is the ego? And he gives the answer, but a dream of what you really are. Just a dream of what you really are. What you really are is not a dream, that's a reality. But if you start dreaming of what you really are, if you start dreaming about the love, which we were using it through lesson 127, or the light, you could say, or the peace and stillness of mind, the presence and grace of God, then if you dream only about it, if you just talk about it, if you just use concepts and share concepts about it, that's what the ego is. A thought, you are apart from your Creator, and a wish to be what He created not. See, it's still the wish what God created not. God did not create an ego. God did not create a body. God did not create limited thoughts. So to have still a wish to abide in limitation is what the ego is, as a thought, as these limited thought forms, or this, I said, thought, a system, a way of thinking, yeah? A thought system. It is a thing of madness, not reality at all. A name for namelessness is all it is. A symbol of impossibility, a choice for options that do not exist. So he makes here quite a list of a definition of what the ego is, and we will continue because it continues a couple more paragraphs, and then I will come in with some more, with a wrap up with the textbook, okay? So just be prepared. We are now really about to have a good look at the ego, because all when we look at the ego is that we recognize and learn who we are not. Who we are not. A symbol of impossibility, a choice for options that do not exist. We call it that to help us understand that it is nothing but an ancient thought that what is made has immortality. But what could come of this except a dream which, like all dreams, could only die? What is the ego? Second time questioning it. Nothingness. This is the reality of what the ego really is. When you go into the experience, when you go into, like, why don't you do that right now? Just seek the ego, be the ego. What you believe an ego or your self-identity is, this I is. And this is really the guidance that is given in self-inquiry from that lineage of Ramana Maharshi and Papaji, which also I came about and moved then, of the Course in Miracles was given me. And you have to have not just the conceptual understanding, but a real experience of the nothingness that you believed is your reality or would have something to do with your reality. So here he gives it plainly on the dish, nothingness, but in a form that seems like something. In a world of form, the ego cannot be denied, for it alone seems real. How could God's Son, as He created Him, abide in form or in a world of form? That's a good question. How could you, as God's Son, and as your Father created you, abide in form or in a world of form? Who asks you to define the ego and explain how it arose can be but he who thinks it real and seeks by definition to ensure that its elusive nature is concealed behind the words that seem to make it so. See, here is where the part of the decision shows up again. This is a choice. You choose that, that you want to have it real, that you think it real. That's a choice, moment by moment choice. Yeah? Concealed behind the words that seem to make it so. There is no definition for a lie that serves to make it true, nor can there be a truth that lies conceal effectively. The ego's unreality is not denied by words, nor is it meaning clear because its nature seems to have a form. So very important here also, the unreality, the non-reality of the ego is not denied by words. It means like it's not being done by just saying, well, the ego isn't real. No? It's not about that. I already said and directed you. You will have to undergo a clear and full experience of that to know it to be nothing. Nor is its meaning clear because its nature seems to have a form. The ego's nature seems to show up as your world as you perceive it. So it seems to have a form, but its meaning doesn't make it clear just because you're perceiving forms. Who can define the undefinable? And yet there is an answer even here. We cannot really make a definition for what the ego is. We cannot. Did you hear that? We cannot really make a definition. We do not really have words to describe and define and express and teach what the ego is. But what can we do? We can say what it is not. What it is not. As I said before, we are just learning, therefore, who we are not. And so we can also say what it is not. So it is not the love of God as we started out with the lesson of the day. And this is shown to us with perfect clarity. It is from this that we deduce all that the ego is. Look at its opposite and you can see the only answer that is meaningful. The ego's opposite in every way, in origin, effect and consequence, we call a miracle. And here we find all that is not the ego in the world. Here is the ego's opposite, and here alone we look at what the ego was. For here we see all that it seemed to do and cause, and its effects must still be one. Where there was darkness, now we see the light. What was the ego? What the darkness was. Where was the ego? Where the darkness was. Beautiful, isn't it? So now the question is, you are already out of here. So you can ask, what was the ego? What the darkness was? Where was the ego? Where the darkness was? You are not there, you are in light. You are light. What is now and where can it be found? Nothing and nowhere. Now the light has come. Its opposite has gone without a trace. Where evil was, there now is holiness. What is the ego? What the evil was. The evil is like another word for the separation thought. Where is the ego? In an evil, or you could say separated, split dream that but seemed real while you were dreaming it. Where there was crucifixion stands God's Son. What is the ego? Who has need to ask? Where is the ego? Who has need to seek for an illusion now the dreams are gone? Applause. Isn't it awesome? This is just amazing. This is incredible. Okay, so let me just get here quickly into a quick song, because I see the transmission on YouTube finished. I'll be right back with you, and then we might just go into some few forms of the textbook, expressions of the textbook. Thank you so much. This is now we are here online again on a second part on YouTube also, and we can continue having finished up this part of the clarifications of terms of what is the ego, and I love how he puts it in this, giving us the questions. Now, what is the ego? Who has need to ask? Because only one who has any involvement or interest or investment in the ego will even ask this question. If you are gone in the peace of God, you will not have a notion of needing to know what the ego is. And so it is, where is the ego? Who has need to seek for an illusion now the dreams are gone? It's amazing, it's wonderful, it's beautifully expressed, and thank you so much for being part here in this teaching, looking at the clarifications of terms, because it is a kind of a fundament and basis of how we hold actually this understanding of the course, how we approach it first conceptually with our own interpretations, and then finally see that there's just light and love everywhere in each of these meanings that are given to this course. And so it will be a pleasure to me now to share with you a part within the chapters within the textbook. And here in chapter 3, in the 4th section, the error and the ego, he gives here in 2 paragraphs quite an interesting aspect about what the ego is within, how we question or put questions and try to find answers within our conceptual mind. And he expresses here, this is Jesus, right, in A Course in Miracles, that the ego is the questioning aspect of the post-separation self, which was made rather than created. See, that is where it became no longer the extension of God's creative thought, but a making up a world and a self-identity. And so he calls it the post-separation self. No? And it is a questioning, it's the questioning aspect. It is capable of asking questions, but not of perceiving meaningful answers. That's also a very core expression for a good understanding what we are here talking about and dealing with. No? So the ego is capable of asking questions, and even if you ask question at the last question, what am I or who am I, the ego is still involved because it is a question. But the ego is not capable to give a meaningful answer. And so the meaningful answer, the only meaning, the true meaning has to come from the Holy Spirit himself. And the reason why the ego doesn't perceive meaningful answers is because this would involve knowledge and cannot be perceived. So everything where knowledge comes in that is of God, the ego is finished, perception is over. The mind is therefore confused because only one-mindedness can be without confusion. A separated or divided mind must be confused. It is necessarily uncertain about what it is. It has to be in conflict because it is out of accord with itself. And this makes its aspects strangers to each other. And this is the essence of the fear-bound condition in which attack is always possible. So you see, he talks already what the ego is making up in the mind. Strangers, conflict, fear condition, attack. You have every reason to feel afraid as you perceive yourself, he says. This is why you cannot escape from fear until you realize that you did not and could not create yourself. See, this will always be the point, and we touched that very clearly in the last episode when we touched mind and spirit. It is all about acknowledging that I do have a creator, that I do have a real source and cause. I am not the cause of myself. I did not make myself. I did not create myself. I have a creator and I call him God. You can never make your misperceptions true, and your creation is beyond your own error. That is also very important because whenever we align with God's mind, and that is where creation starts, then it is beyond all error. That is why you must eventually choose to heal the separation. We cannot stay separated, neither in a separate perception between us and the world, nor between each other. And then he gives another perspective of saying that came actually in that paragraph before that, in the second paragraph, that consciousness, the level of perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation. Now here we get to an understanding what was going on and what we really call consciousness. It was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. Consciousness is correctly identified as the, and here it is, I always refer to that part, the domain of the ego. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. The ego is a wrong-minded attempt to perceive yourself as you wish to be rather than as you are. See, here's again the choice. I want to perceive myself as I wish to perceive myself rather than knowledge to recognize who I am. That would be knowingness, knowledge. Yet you can know yourself only as you are. You see, here it is exactly what we are talking about. You can know yourself only as you are. because that is all you can be sure of. Everything else is open to question. And so if everything else is open to question, then why don't you see that this questioning part that the ego is doesn't have a real answer? And so asking the one question, what am I, and directing the mind for the real answer to the Holy Spirit is really all that is needed in order to clarify what we are talking about, and clarify also the question, what is the ego? In another part in chapter 4, so we were in chapter 3, and now we come to chapter 4 in the second section, the ego and false autonomy. He is teaching us in the 7th paragraph that the ego literally lives by comparisons. And that is very familiar to everyone who already observed his mind, one's mind, for as part of the mind training. And then you know, okay, this is the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the happy and the sad, the beautiful and the ugly, and so on. It's always put those differences so that the ego can continue to make comparisons. And of course you can compare me with some other teachers and say, well, that is valuable or that is not valuable. And then you're just in your ego mind living by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. Wow, what an expression, you see. If you really want to experience our equality and the equality of the sonship, the one Son of God, the oneness who we are as God created us, then we cannot stay in any comparison or compare ourselves with anybody or anything. And charity must be our nature and not an impossibility. But in the comparison, there is no true charity possible, because the involvement of the ego doesn't allow it. The ego never gives out of abundance. See, it will always get something back. It will always want to have something back. It will never only give. But here it is, God only gives. So His Son, who you are, have the same premise. You also can only give. And as we heard in yesterday's lesson, all that I give is given to myself. I only give it to myself, to my true self indeed. But the ego never gives out of abundance, because it was made as a substitute for it. And that is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites, needs, are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. Getting mechanisms. What an expression. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. That is what we also practice in our war scenarios. And in every fight, in every conflict, this is what is going on. In a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. Now let's listen here very carefully. We are almost done here. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. Whenever you think, brother, you're completely on your own, then know that you're caught up in the ego thought system, in the ego's mind's belief. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It doesn't attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. See, it is not any longer in the perspective of our mind. We cannot conceive of it at all. It does. It doesn't attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of spirit, here's a good answer to this first episode, as we had it in the last episode last Saturday. It does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional and are delusional. Yeah, it is all delusional what is invested as self-esteem in something temporary, in something that is not permanent, that is just transitory, because this is where the ego operates. On that level operates the ego. So thank you so much. Of course, there are thousands of or hundreds of other like these expressions within the textbook and the lessons and the teacher's manual. I gave you here just an excerpt, a little example of what you find when you really let go and accept this guidance of A Course in Miracles as a guidance for your personal transformation. And this is what it is for, because as you heard, it is here in order to realize who you are. So with that, we leave it for today, and I just thank you with all of my heart for you being here, being present, being with me, being with that teaching of the Course in Miracles, which means being with the Holy Spirit, being and walking with Christ. And that is your dependence on God and your acknowledgement that God is your creator, is your cause, is your source, and that you didn't make yourself. Thank you. With that, I just let you go, and I love you with all my heart, and in that experience that there is no love but God's. Bye-bye.